Tomorrow, a public consultation on whether to update the Gender Recognition Act draws to a close. You might know this better as the debate over whether to make it easier for trans and non-binary people to legally self-declare as the opposite gender. The government says the current process, which involves applying for a gender recognition certificate, seeking a doctor's backing and living in the role for 2 years, has been criticised for being too bureaucratic, expensive and intrusive. Since the Act came into force in 2004, only 4,910 people have legally changed their gender. Transgender campaigners say that they represent a vulnerable, marginalised group and it's time to bring in the reforms. We asked Peter Dunn, a law lecturer at the University of Bristol, to explain the difference between the current law and what the government's proposing.
So currently the law is set out in the Gender Recognition Act 2004, and I suppose what it does is that it imposes some conditions upon which individuals who want to have their legal gender recognised. So one of the conditions is that they have to be able to show that they have or had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. In addition, the individual has to be able to show that they have lived in their acquired gender for at least 2 years. The individual has to be 18 years old, and the individual has to identify or seek a gender recognition certificate as either male or female.
And how do they get one of those certificates?
So they apply to what's called a gender recognition panel, and they provide evidence of all of the elements that I've talked to. And it's the gender recognition panel that confers what's called a gender recognition certificate. And when you have a gender recognition certificate, the law recognises that acquired gender for all legal purposes, save in some very specific circumstances set out in the Act.
So just to be absolutely clear, if a man wants to identify as a woman, a trans woman is not legally recognised as a woman until she has been through those stages.
So in law, that person will retain a male legal gender until they have obtained a gender recognition certificate. The Equality Act 2010 will respect that person's gender reassignment characteristic without a gender recognition certificate in some circumstances. But in law, the person retains a male legal gender.
So they are not legally recognised as a woman?
Without a gender recognition certificate, that is correct.
And so what is the government seeking to do now with its consultation?
The government is seeking to do what a number of jurisdictions around Europe have done, which is to bring in a model called self-identification. And that is to remove certain requirements that currently exist and to streamline the process so that individuals who want to obtain a gender recognition certificate can do so by making a statutory declaration affirming their preferred gender or their acquired gender.
How different will that be from the current situation? Will it make it easier for somebody to live as a woman if they want to, without having to go through so many stages?
Well, it means that the individual will not have to show that they've lived in their preferred gender for 2 years, and you won't have to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, so you won't have to engage with a doctor to the extent that you will not now.
Now, that is what the government has put forward as a proposal and is being consulted upon. But does that necessarily mean that it will happen?
Depends upon the results of the consultation, and it depends upon how the government chooses to act afterwards. The government has shown, I suppose, a strong willingness to do that. This has been recommended specifically by the House of Commons Select Committee on Women and Equalities. There are a number of international bodies that have now recommended self-determination. But if the government chooses not to take it forward, well, then the law will remain as it is at the moment.
Peter Dunn. Well, Penny Mordaunt is the Minister for Equality, is in charge with introducing any changes. But some people are saying that she may have a tough time getting them approved by Parliament. The issue's become heated after a transgender prisoner who retained her male genitalia was accused of raping 2 women in a women's jail. And there have been concerns raised about the effect, for example, on women's changing rooms and refuges. The Conservative MP for Monmouth, David Davies, is opposed to reforming the law. He's held a meeting with colleagues in Parliament this week as part of his campaign to block the changes.
Well, the meeting was with the purpose of allowing women's rights activists who have grave concerns about these changes to air their views to other members of Parliament who are not hearing the arguments on both sides of the issue. I'm certainly very concerned. In fact, I will oppose these changes as they're being planned at the moment. I think it's an outrage that the government are planning to allow people to simply change their sex based on their own definition, because that is going to have a huge impact on women's rights, and it's going to mean that people who most people would perceive as male, with male bodies, will be able to go into prisons, women's hospital wards, women's refuges, women's changing rooms, and all sorts of other areas where women expect a measure of privacy. In no way was this meeting about having a go at anyone who's transgendered. Absolutely not. We're totally opposed to any form of discrimination. This is about women's rights and women's rights to privacy and safety.
But aren't you making it more difficult for trans people to live as they wish to? At the moment, they have to live for 2 years as their new gender without being legally recognised. Why not make it a little bit easier? Maybe reduce that timescale, for instance.
What the government want to do is to reduce the timescale to nothing and allow anyone who wants to wake up and basically declare themselves as being of a different gender. If that were to happen, that's going to have a very big impact because of course the vast majority of people who are trans women haven't had any form of medical operation. To put it rather bluntly, they have male genitalia and they will be seen as being male. I would never stop anyone from living their life as they wish to, but I would draw a line in the sand where that person wants to have access to areas where women who are biologically female currently have an expectation of privacy. It's not just prisons. I mean, that's been mentioned. Women's refuges is another area where there will be issues. Women's self-help groups. I know a lot of MPs are worried about it, but MPs are worried about speaking up because the trans lobby, not transgender people, but the trans lobby is so powerful, it's making it difficult for women to air their concerns.
Have you been personally targeted in any way for speaking out?
Absolutely. I've been, well, apart from the usual abuse on social media, I have faced one investigation by the Standards Commissioner for the last meeting. I was called in again to see the Sergeant at Arms over this meeting and the previous one, although in the end they decided they didn't want to. I was threatened with a police investigation by another Conservative MP, so it's not surprising, frankly, that MPs are worried about raising this issue. And the women's rights groups who've raised this issue, they've faced physical as well as verbal abuse.
Do you think the government was wrong to even launch this consultation?
Yes, I do, because the whole consultation was based on the report from the Equalities Committee, which itself did not take verbal evidence from women's rights groups who were worried about these changes.
It sounds as if, you have not had much sympathy from the parliamentary authorities when you've been trying to discuss this openly. What does that make you think about them?
Well, again, I raised after the Karen White case where a male-bodied person went in and sexually assaulted females in a prison. I raised this as an urgent question following evidence from the prison authorities about the fact there's been no change in the guidance, but it wasn't even deemed as an urgent question. I think the fact that a person who has male body is able to go into a women's prison and sexually assault 4 women, knowing in fact, as we do, that most women in the prison system are already the victims of sexual abuse, or many of them are anyway, and male violence. I think it's outrageous that we just are allowing this to happen and not even looking to change the guidance or even allow MPs to raise this matter in Parliament. And I have to say, I've never known anything like this in 13 years as an